So welcome to another module with me again, Max. Now that we worked a lot on the look and feel of our page, on the responsive design, and that manual ensured that you learn how you can do that, how you can adjust your page to different device sizes and screen sizes. Now that we got all of that out of the way, let's dive back into adding some content to our demo page here. And let's add some content which is basically available on almost any web page you see. Forms and form elements. Elements where users can input data, be that an email address, a password, or anything like that. So what's inside this module? You will learn how you can style inputs and buttons. We'll have a look at different kinds of inputs and how you can adjust their look to fit the overall look of your page, or, well, the look you basically want to achieve. We'll also have a look at validation styles, so how you can give the user feedback about whether a value entered into a field is valid or not, how you can give such feedback to the user by changing the way the input looks, for example by adding a red border or something like that. That's what we'll dive into, so why don't we just start and have a look at all these things, starting with the next video. So back on our page, the page I now want to work on is this Start Hosting page, which we currently don't have. That's why clicking Start Hosting in the nav bar, or why clicking Yes here in our modal, always leads to a not found error. Now we're going to change this. Attached to this video, you find the content for the to be added page. For that, we first of all need to add a new folder in the root level of our project, and I'll name it Start-Hosting. Now, the naming here is important. You're generally free to name this however you want, but you should keep in mind that we already got some links to that folder. For example, in our navigation, we link to Start Hosting and then index.html, so you should keep that structure to ensure that all these links work. That's the next thing we have to add. We should add an index.html file in there so that we can add some content. Now, the content for that file, however, can be found attached to this video. There you find some HTML code, which you can simply enter into this file here, into that index.html file. It's a HTML skeleton as you know it. We have our navigation bar, we have the backdrop, we got some form content then too. Now if we save this and we reload the page and we click on Start Hosting or on Yes here in the modal, we see that newly added page. Here it is, a bit bigger. Now the footer and the header looks okay. Now the footer has a tiny issue. Footer class main footer. We're missing some footer class here. So let's quickly add that. We can take it from the main index.html file. There we can basically copy that unordered list element with the main footer links class and the list item element with the main footer link class, and we replace the unordered list opening tag and the list item opening tag with that, and then we also copy the class on the list item to the second class, to the second element. With that, if we reload, the footer looks good, the overall page looks good, except for the form maybe. We definitely can work on that, and this will be what we work on in this module. So let's dive into how we can style the different elements here. You see we have a drop down, we got normal inputs, and we got a checkbox as well as a button. How we can style all these things. Let's actually start with the title here before we dive into the different inputs. And for the title, if we go to the Start Hosting folder and there into the index.html file, we see that here we got that sign up title class assigned to it. So let's now add a start-hosting.css file in the Start Hosting folder and make sure you're importing it. It should be there. The import should already be there though, because we added it to the code you copied into that page. And in that Start Hosting CSS file, we can select that sign up title class element. And there, for example, align the text in the center. Give it, let's say, a font size of 1.8 rem so that it's looking good and a bit bigger than normal text. And maybe also add a color, which could be FF5454. That's a reddish color. Now if we reload, this looks better. Now maybe some distance would be nice. So let's add a class, a selector for the main element. And there, let's add a padding top of 2 rem. Also, as we did it on the other pages, we have different paddings. Maybe 2 rem is too much. Let's add 1 rem. But it's just so that we have some space between our content and the header. Now with that, we worked on the title. Now obviously we are here to work on the form and the input elements. Now for that, let's go back to the index.html file and let's have a look at what we got here. We have a form element here with the class signup form. And in there, we always have combinations of labels and then input elements like this select element or a bunch of normal inputs or also our terms and conditions. There we have some special setup where the label actually wraps our link here to the terms and conditions, but is then also positioned next to a checkbox input. The difference to the other labels is that it's coming after the input because we want to have the look of having the label after the checkbox instead of in front of it. That's the general look we have here. Now, there is no single correct way of styling form inputs and elements. You can find dozens of solutions. For example, one thing you see in some solutions is that you wrap your labels and inputs into divs. So you would put each pair of label and input into a div. And then you could also give that div some class like input group or form group or whatever you want. And give that some style where you essentially maybe set a margin to the bottoms or a margin to the next element that's coming after it. This is one way of styling this. You could absolutely do that. Here I will follow a different approach though, and I will not style it like this. Instead, I will target labels and the different inputs individually. Because I need to do this anyway, as I also plan on applying different stylings to these elements. Let's start with some basic stylings. In the start hosting CSS file, let's start by selecting our labels, inputs, and select elements. So basically all types of elements we have in our form except for the button. And let's turn them into block level elements. Now, why do I want to do that? Because normally they're all inline elements. As you can clearly see here, they're all in one line. This is actually something you might want. Maybe you want to position some of them next to each other. But here, I want to position them below each other. And therefore, I need to change their default behavior and turn them to block level elements. For that, we could simply select label, input, and select elements with their tag selectors. However, I will combine that with the signup form class and use the descendant combinator. So signup -form and then some white space, just to ensure that only elements which are inside of that form receive that style. Now on our page, this is technically not required, but if we would have some scenario where we got some other input on the page, let's say a search bar in the header, for example, then we might not want to style it in the same way as we style our form, hence the combinator approach here. The style I want to apply here is that I want to set display to block, as I said, and that I also want to add a margin top of, let's say, 1 rem to add some distance between all these elements. If we do that and we reload, we can already see a difference. Now all the elements are beneath each other. Now that's not looking perfect, we'll work on that, but it's better. We can also see one other thing though, even though they're all block level elements, and we can inspect them here, to see that they indeed do take up the full width, we see that the majority of the available width is occupied with nothing, with a margin. For form inputs like select or input, we actually also need to set the width to 100 to force them to expand over the full available width. Now, clearly, this is not looking super beautiful here, but we'll work on that and we'll change the width of the overall form soon enough. Now, this is the first step I wanted to take. Now, one problem we have is the styling of the checkbox. This actually, if we inspect our HTML code, is also a normal input element here. But in this case, I don't want to set it to block. It should stay an inline element because I actually want to ensure that this checkbox is positioned next to its label. And therefore, this current approach of just setting it to be a block level element does not work. We'll have to change that. And actually, we will change this and learn about attribute selectors and use them in the next lecture. In this video, I want to work on my checkbox, and to select it correctly, I'll actually use an advanced attribute selector. Now, what do I mean with that? We can select elements by attribute like this. For example, with that, we would select any element which has a type attribute. That would normally be true for any input element. And we could also select by disabled or something like that. Now, we can do more than just select with just the attribute. We can also restrict the set of found elements that have this attribute. For example, you could say, we only want to select an element or elements with a specific attribute value. So the type attribute, for example, should not just be set, it should also be equal to email. So this would, for example, select all inputs which are of type email, but not the ones which are of type password or text. We could also say that we want to select an element with a specific attribute value in a list. Now, what do I mean with that? Here's an example. Please notice this tilde sign in front of the equal sign. This is an important part of the syntax. And this would, for example, match a paragraph that has a lang attribute, which actually has more than one value. So in the lang attribute value, we got en-us and en-gb. And even though it's a bit hard to see here, these two values are separated with a white space, with a blank. And therefore, this is just a list of values for the lang attribute. And with this attribute selector at the top here, we're saying, please select any element that has en-us in its list. It might have more values than that, but it has to have en-us. Now, we won't use this in this module, but this is also nice to know. Another way of restricting the set of found elements is that we say we want to have an element with a specific attribute value or this attribute value as a prefix. Now here's another example. The syntax uses the pipe symbol in front of the equal sign, and here we would, for example, match this paragraph element. The interesting part here is that in our selector, we're saying lang should be equal to en or actually start with en. And the important part is that start means that it has to be followed immediately after the part we have in the selector, so after the en, by a dash. But after the dash, you may have any combination of characters you want. Therefore, this would match this paragraph tag here, which has a lang attribute with the en-us value, because our selector matches both just en as well as en-something. Now that, just like the other one next to it we saw a second ago, these are some special cases, mostly useful if you're working with these lang attributes, but nice to know. We also can select an element with a specific attribute value prefix. Here's an example. Here we're selecting, with that special character here in front of the equal sign, we're selecting any element which starts with a hash. So where the value of the ref attribute starts with a hash, to be precise. That would match an internal link, for example. So here we have a anchor tag linking to some ID on our page, the all ID to be precise. And with that selector, we would target this element, we would get this element, because we are selecting all elements here which do have this href attribute and where the value of that attribute starts with a hash. And thereafter, you may have any characters you want. So it's more flexible than the one you see in the top right corner with the pipe symbol. We also can target a suffix instead of a prefix. Then we use a $sign in front of the equal sign. And here we are targeting all elements that have the href attribute and that start with .de. So for example, we would match this element which has ab.de as an anchor tag reference. And again, this can be really useful because we don't care about the characters in front of that ending part, in front of that suffix, and therefore we get a lot of flexibility here. We can also target elements with at least one attribute value. For that, we would use the star in front of the equal sign, and here we would target all elements that have the source attribute and where the source attribute then holds some content which contains CDN. Doesn't have to be at the beginning, doesn't have to be at the end, just somewhere in the value. For example, we would target this image where CDN is right in the middle. It could be at the beginning too, though, that's important. And last but not least, we can also turn on case sensitivity or turn it off, depending on what we want. If we add that I character here at the end of our squared brackets, so before the closing square bracket, then we would also target this element where we have CDN in all uppercase characters. Note that in our selectors we wrote it in lowercase characters, and with the I we're just saying we should be case insensitive. If you don't add the I, you are case sensitive, that's the default. But with the I, you can turn that off and you can ensure that now you select elements no matter if the value you're looking for is lowercase, uppercase, or mixed uppercase and lowercase characters. These are the advanced attribute selectors, which can come in handy. And in the next lecture, we'll see some of them in action when we try to select our checkbox input. Now that we learned about the different types of selectors, attribute selectors we can use, how can we select this input of type checkbox? Well, there is one obvious way of doing that, I'd say, but there also are other ways. So let's try different ways. In the start hosting CSS file, I'll add my sign up form selector because again, I'll use the descendant combinator. And then I want to target all inputs which have a certain attribute. And the easiest way of targeting the checkbox would be to select inputs which have the type attribute where the type attribute value equals checkbox. And that would only be correct for our checkbox element here. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that approach, and it would be the approach you use in reality probably. However, let's copy that and comment out the first approach. We could also say we want to target all elements where the ID attribute contains the term terms, so the word terms. Because if we go back, we see that our checkbox has an ID attribute which contains terms. We could have also looked for agree terms or just agree. This also is only true for this input, so this is also a perfectly fine selector here. Now, there are of course other ways of doing that too. You could search for the suffix terms or the prefix agree, or with the pipe symbol agree, which would also include agree dash terms. There are other ways. Definitely feel free to play around with that. Now I will go with this ID selector here. The question is, how do we want to style this now? I want to set the display here to inline block. I still want to have the block level features, for example, the margin to the top, but I also want to position this inline with my label, which is next to it. Therefore, this is something I definitely need. Speaking of that, we should also select that label. And if we have a look at our HTML code, we see that the label is coming after this input. Now again, we got a couple of ways for selecting the label. We could select it by attribute selector. We could use that for attribute and again use terms or something like that. We can also use a combinator though. We can copy that input ID terms selector and add a comma after it, then add it again, and now use the plus combinator and label. This will target all labels that directly follow this element, which is only the case for this label here. So now with that, we're setting this to inline block 2, and I'll set the width back to auto for now. With that, if we save all of that and we go back to our project and reload, we actually see that the label and our checkbox are back in one line. And we also see that the button is in the same line. We'll take care about this later. For now, this is a great first step, bringing us closer to our desired outcome. Now let's also take care about the button immediately. And I'll do that by using another selector. I'll use my sign up form and select the button which has type submit. Technically, we would not need this because it's the only button, but again, to practice all these attribute selectors. And for that button, I'll then simply set the display to block like this. If we reload now, button is in a new line. Let's maybe also add a little bit of margin to the top of 1 rem to have some distance in there. And now this is looking better in my opinion. Now we got this nice structure here, ensuring that our code looks good, or our form looks good, I should say. Why is the button now not spanning over the full width, you might wonder? Well, it is a block level element, but just like inputs, it by default doesn't take all the width for its content. We would have to manually set width 100%, and I'm not interested in doing this here. Now, with these first steps taken, before we dive into the actual styling of the single elements, let's switch into mobile mode, because Manuel explained that we would develop everything mobile first from now on, and we will. Now, this doesn't look too bad on mobile right now. It also doesn't look great. Now, the general structure of having all these elements beneath each other will be the same, but now we should work on, well, centering that correctly, maybe adding some padding, stuff like that. So let's do that. For that, I'll go up in my CSS file, and below the sign-up title, I'll add a style for the sign-up form. And there we could just add a padding of 1 rem to all directions, so that if we reload the page, our content isn't sitting directly on the edges. So this certainly looks better in my opinion. We also can target our sign-up form label in general here and give it a font weight of bold. This will just ensure that the labels are a bit easier to see, I'd say. So this also is, in my opinion, a quite nice style. Now for bigger screens, if we're not in the mobile mode, this is way too big though. So we should add a media query at the bottom maybe, and give it a min width of 40 rem, which is the breakpoint we used on the other pages too. There we also used 40 rem quite a bit. And in there, I now also want to target my sign up form and give it a margin of auto and maybe a width of 30 rem. If we save that and reload, now our form is narrower, it's centered in the middle too, and only if we shrink the size to smaller devices, it also, well, snaps to the edges and takes the full available width. And it doesn't grow on bigger screens, because it shouldn't. So this is now certainly looking better. Now maybe it's still a bit too wide, a bit too much space. So we could decrease that. We could set it to, let's say, 25 rem, like this. And now I think this is looking good. Now, obviously, we have this edge case here where we're on a smaller device and it's quite big. But actually, keep in mind, I'm zoomed in here. This actually looks good on the smaller devices we do use in reality. So I'm liking that look. With that out of the way, with the general layout set, it's now time to continue, and now I want to focus on styling the individual form elements. So let's work on the form element styling on the dropdown, the inputs here, and the checkbox. Now, how does that work? Let's start with the dropdown and the normal inputs. For that, I'll go to my code, to my CSS code here. And before we style the button, but after the checkbox styles, let's say, it's up to you where you position it though, I'll add a style where I target sign up form and the inputs in that form, as well as the select elements, because these are the kinds of inputs we're using here on our page. And there, I want to restyle them. I'll start with the border, which I'll set to 1 pixel, solid and a light gray. So CCC is the hex code for a light grayish look. I also want to give them some padding, let's say .2 rem to top and bottom and .5 rem to left and right. And if we save that, we can see a slight change, right? So not for the select element, but for these inputs. Now, one thing we can also see if we type in there is that if you watch closely, the font seems to be a different one. It's not the same font as we use on the rest of the page. Also, it's too small. So we want to use the same font, of course, and we can achieve this by adding font::inherit to tell it should not use the browser defaults, which we can see if we select it before reloading the page. There we can see that the browser sets various text styles. More about text in the next module, by the way. But we want to use our defaults for the text and for the font. So by setting font::inherit on these elements, if I save that and reload, now our elements increased a bit in size, and now when we type there, we got the same font family as on the rest of the page, which of course is what we want probably. Now regarding the dropdown, it clearly looks a bit different than the other elements, and we will change some of the stylings there, but you should keep in mind that the dropdown, this select here, of course is a special element where you actually want to use the browser defaults in many cases, because you want to have these arrows on the right, you want to have that built-in behavior of getting that drop-down list without needing to write any custom JavaScript code. That is why I will stick to the defaults we got here. At the end of this module, however, you find an article where you also find various links to resources where you can dive deeper into restyling even built-in elements a bit more. And that being said, we will restyle that checkbox together in this module. So we'll leave the select as it is for now. We'll leave the inputs here as they are. However, I'm not so happy about that blue border here. And this border actually turns out to not be a border. If we select the input like this one, and we click here in the developer tools on that ::huff thing here, we can trigger a certain pseudo selector. And in this case, for an input element, that's the focus selector. If I trigger this here, you see the focus style as it appears when you click in there, but now all the time, even if your mouse is outside of there. So this is now our focus style. And with that triggered, if we scroll down, we can see that for this being focused, we got an outline here. A WebKit, focus, ring, color, auto outline. Now, what is an outline? Is this the same as a border? An outline is kind of comparable to a border, but there are some crucial differences. For example, the outline always comes after the border, so you can have both. It's added outside of the border. It's not counting towards the box size, and it also is not doing anything on the box shadow. So if you have a big outline, this won't affect your box shadow, for example. So outline is a great tool to mark that this has been focused, but I want to change the way we do that actually still. So what I'll add after my selectors here is another rule where I target sign-up form input, and now with :focus, I target the focus state, and the same for the select element. Now I want to set a different style when we focus this, and I'll actually set the outline to none, though you could of course also use a different color here. And I'll change instead the background color of these elements. I'll change it to a very light gray, which has the hex code D8F3DF. And I'll change the border color. We do have a border, keep that in mind. I just want to change the color now to the green we're using on our page already. So this green color, which we also have in our shared folder in the navigation bar, for example, as a background. This here, this is the hex code I also want to use here as a border color. With that, if we save that and reload, if I click in there, now we got a different look. And actually, this is no light gray, excuse me, it's a light green, of course, should fit the border. So now we have that look also for the dropdown whenever we target these elements. It fits the rest of our page a bit better, and green always looks positive, I guess. So with that, we made some work on restyling these inputs. We ensured that they use our general font and that we can manipulate their styles. Of course, you can do to them whatever you want to do. Now, I also want to restyle the checkbox though. And for that, if we select the checkbox, we see that actually it already received some styles. We already targeted with our sign-up form input styles, and we're setting a border, padding, and font. It's just not doing anything because that clickable text box thingy here is something special in our browser in the end, and we'll work on that. Now we will work on it in the next lecture. So let's work on this checkbox now. And first of all, I want to ensure that these styles here, which target all inputs, which includes the checkbox, do not target the checkbox. I don't want that. So what I will do here is I will go to this input selector here and actually add the not pseudo selector. Not allows us to say that it should target all inputs which do not fulfill the requirement we add here inside of the parentheses. And that requirement just is another selector. So here I will actually add another attribute selector with squared brackets, type equals checkbox. So all inputs which are not of type checkbox will receive these styles. And on the other hand, the checkbox will not receive them. And that's exactly what I want. Now we can also add that to our sign up form input down there in front of the focus pseudo selector. And with that, everything should work as before. And we don't see a visual difference. But if you inspect your checkbox, you see that it doesn't get the default input styles other than display block and so on, which it should get. It doesn't get the other ones though. So with that, we're ready to restyle it. And how do we do that? Well, for that, we need to select the checkbox. We already saw how we could do this here. Let me copy that selector and add it again, maybe here in front of the button. And just to mix things up, I'll use type equals checkbox here, just to prove that this also works. And now in there, we can change its look. Now what we can do, for example, is we could give it a border of 1 pixel, solid, and also this slight gray we got on all our inputs. We could add a background. Let's set it to white. And maybe give it a width of 1 rem and a height of 1 rem. So I'm basically building a box here. Keep in mind, our checkbox is of type display inline block, so we can build it as a box. I build a box which has a border, white background, and is 1 rem wide and high. If we do that, and we save that, and we reload, yeah, it increased in size, but I don't see a white background, I don't see my border, we still got that default style. However, it clearly does receive our styles, as we can confirm if we select it. Here, all these styles are applied. Now the thing is, just as to select, the checkbox is a special type of input. If we scroll down to its browser default styles, we see that it gets this WebKit appearance style, which sets it to checkbox. For the select, by the way, we can also see WebKit appearance menu list. These are important default styles that define that the select has these errors and works like this, and that the checkbox works like this. If you want to change that, you have to overwrite it. Now, this would also be possible for the select dropdown, but I wanted to do it on the checkbox since that's a bit more interesting in my opinion. So let's override it by setting that dash WebKit appearance style. Now, don't be irritated by that leading dash here. This is a valid property name. It's looking strange because it's a browser specific one. It's not the same in all browsers, and that's why it's starting with a dash. And we should set it to none to disable that default. If we now save that and reload, now we got the new style. And now we can't check it actually. We'll work on that. We got our style at least. Now, as I said, this is browser specific, so we should also add mods appearance, which is actually the attribute required by Mozilla, to override the default look there too. And let's add appearance in general and set it to none. This will also, well, help all browsers that understand it and that don't have their browser default. Or actually, it would override the browser default here if it also understands this syntax. So now we're forcing this checkbox to look the way we want it to look. Now, before we continue styling it, one thing we can see is that it's now not inline or not centered, vertically centered to the label. So we can fix this by going up to our checkbox and label selector and setting vertical align to middle. Let's try that. Let's save that and reload. That looks better. Now you could also try different values like bottom, for example, which in this case, in my opinion, looks even better a tiny bit because now they're aligning at the bottom, and I believe this looks better here. Now, one thing that's missing, of course, is our ability to check this and to see a difference. It's important to understand that technically this still can be checked. So if I click in there, this actually behind the scenes is switching between being checked and not being checked. We just don't see that here. The reason for this is that no style is set for this being checked. Previously, the WebKit appearance did this for us, the default value set by the browser, but since we overrode this to be none, we have to do it manually. So let's again target sign up form input type equals checkbox, or feel free to try out a different selector here. And in there, now we use the checked pseudo class. So as you see, you work a lot with pseudo classes when working with forms. Now in here, we set the styles we want to set for the checked mode. And there, I just want to set the background to my light green color and change the border to my dark green color, which we also use in other places of the app, for example here, so this dark green. I'll copy that from the main header brand and enter it as a color here. Now with that, if we reload, we can actually check this as you see. The remaining part just is that I want to get rid of that outline. So when we're focusing this checkbox, I don't want to have an outline. So therefore, maybe I just remove that not selector from all the other inputs and see if that works the way I want it to work. Yeah, this now certainly looks better. So now we got our custom checkbox here with our own style overwriting the default. And with that, we achieved a lot. Let's also check this on the mobile screen. That's looking good there too. So now let's see what else we can do with that form. Now that we worked on all these styles here, on the styles of our elements, let's think about validation. Now, what does validation mean? Validation means that in a real form, we typically require certain things. We want to make sure that no field is empty, for example, that the email field has a valid email address, stuff like that. Now, there are tons of ways of implementing validation, and this is not really about the implementation logic. You normally always have to do validation on the server as a side note, so validate the inputs on your server-side code because the client can always be tricked. Here, it's only about providing nice user feedback. Now, which typical approaches do you have for validation? Typically, as I said, you use server-side validation. So you click that button, a HTTP request is sent to the server, and once it reaches the server, it there is validated, and maybe if it's invalid, the form page is returned to the client, and you present it to the user again, and you want to mark the inputs which are invalid as invalid. Now, one obvious approach to giving the user such feedback is that you define special CSS classes which are attached to an input if it is invalid. And it is attached to that input on the server side when this page is re-rendered, or also on the client side through JavaScript. Now here we will hard code it in there though, but it's easy to then just add this conditionally in a real project when the form is invalid. So let's say the email would be invalid. Then you might add a class named invalid. The name is totally up to you though. And again, this is added either on the server when you render the page or through JavaScript. Now here we hard coded it. The idea now is to simply take that invalid class and give it a special style. So now we could, in the end, just go to our sign up form input selector here and say sign up form input.invalid. This simply selects all inputs that are invalid, and probably do the same for selects. And then just maybe set the border to 1 pixel, solid and red, and a background color of well, maybe not red, but some light red color like this. With this, if you save this and reload, now the email would be marked as red. Now the border here, I actually just want to set the border color to red, and I need to reposition this so that this takes priority. I'll add it, of course, and that is the right way after all my other input styles, because this always should override all other styles, because it's only added conditionally anyways. And now we have this clear invalid state. And that's really all that's to it. You would add this class to any input that is deemed invalid. So for example, let's also add it to the checkbox and see how it looks there. And let's also add it to the select element here, class invalid, like this. If we reload, now these are invalid too. So that's pretty cool. So now we have a way of marking these. That's the manual approach. You simply add a class on any condition defined by you, either on the server or through JavaScript, and you simply give that class the invalid styling you want to have. Obviously, you're not restricted to backgrounds and borders here. You can set whatever you want. Now, this is the manual approach. HTML and CSS actually offer you a more elegant way of doing that though. There is a special pseudo selector, the invalid pseudo selector. So let's add another rule here, sign up form, and let's target any element inside of that form. So there is a blank after sign up form, which has the invalid pseudo selector. You could of course also restrict this to only target inputs or selects. Here I'm targeting anything. With this, if I save this and I reload, nothing happens here. But in the email, you actually see, as soon as I click out of there, this now has the invalid style. The reason for this is that HTML, so to say, or the browser, automatically validates this because our email input is of type email, and it detects that T here is no valid email address, and hence it marks this as invalid and adds this special invalid pseudo selector. The only problem we have here is that our nice border is getting overwritten by that not selector here, even though we specify our selector here with invalid after that. The reason for this simply is that not and the selector in not takes a higher priority, and hence this goes first. Now here one solution would be to actually add important. Here you could make an argument for it because this is a temporary class only anyways, and it should override anything else. The other solution, of course, would be to incorporate this not selector here too, and simply add this rule in there too. So add another rule here and target inputs, which are not a checkbox, which are invalid. This is really long though, and from a performance perspective, this is not so good to parse. So maybe we just go with the important solution here in this rare case. So now with that, if we reload and I type a T in there again, it's invalid again. If I start typing, we get the green background because the focus state takes a higher priority, but that's fine. But I'd say this is a nice automatic way of validating this. Now, if you want to validate the other inputs too, this is now just HTML. You can add things like the required attribute, HTML and browser feature, which tells the browser that this is invalid if it's empty. So we can add required to all the inputs here, like this, and to the password. And now if we reload, everything is red right from the start because it's all empty. And only if we enter something there, we get out of that invalid state. Now, it's up to you if you want that. Obviously, you're greeting your user with an all red form here. You could find some combinations. For example, you could change your selector to not select any invalid elements inside the sign up form here, but anything inside a sign up form which has a class needs validation or whatever you want. You're free to name this however you want. And then you add this class dynamically with the help of JavaScript when the submit button was clicked. then you would only, well, apply these styles after the user had a chance of doing something, but you essentially need JavaScript for that. It doesn't work without that. So I'll go with this approach for now. And now we added quick and easy validation. One important note, there also is a valid pseudo selector. And as you might be able to guess, this just does the opposite. So now anything that is treated as valid, and please note that even the button, or the form as a whole to be precise, has this valid invalid style. Now everything that's treated as valid would get these styles. So I'll turn this back to invalid, but again, these are nice things to know. Now one other nice thing to know, in the Mozilla Developer Network documentation for invalid, if you scroll down, you not just see examples, you also can see the browser compatibility, which is quite good. You'll also note that the overall form invalid, and the same is true for valid classes, which we saw in action a second ago when the button became red. This is not supported in all browsers. To be precise, Edge and Internet Explorer, the usual suspects, they don't implement it. So if you're relying on that, might not work. In the way we're using it, on a per input level, this is supported in all browsers though, so that's great. Now with that, we're almost done. Let's focus on this button now before we finish. So we worked on all these inputs. Let's work on the button now. Now, the button actually is something we styled before, because that's clearly not the default browser style. We have a button style in our shared CSS file. There, if you scroll down, you find the button styles at the bottom of the file. Here is how we styled the button. In the end, one important thing you learned there already is that font inherit thing. Because the button, just like the other form elements, has some browser defaults, which actually override your default fonts set up for your entire page. Font inherit makes sure you're inheriting again. You also saw there that you can, well, basically style all the things you always style. Background, border, text color, paddings, stuff like that. You also saw the pseudo classes, hover and active, as well as focus and the outline we used there. Now, one thing I want to show here too is how you can style the disabled state of the button. In a real web project, it's not that uncommon for the button to be disabled until the form as a whole is treated as valid. Now, important note, to switch this button from disabled to enabled, so to remove that disabled attribute, you need JavaScript again, because that is something that needs to change during runtime. This is only possible with JavaScript. So here, we'll again hard-code it in there so that we can see these different styles. Let's go back to the shared CSS file, and for that button, I'll use the button class selector and add the disabled attribute selector. Now this syntax here simply means target any element with the button class that also has a disabled attribute. If I would put a blank in between, this would target all elements with disabled that are nested inside of a button. Of course, we have none of such here in our web app. So with that, we can set up a disabled style. And typically, you want to give the user some idea about that this button is not clickable. For example, you could set the cursor to not allowed. This automatically changes the mouse cursor and gives a clear feedback that this is not clickable. You could also set the border to some gray color, maybe a little bit darker than that though, this maybe. Give it a background of gray then, and also a text color of maybe this darker gray again. With this style, if we save that, and note that our button has the disabled attribute now, if I reload, this clearly does not look clickable. We got no hover effect, and you also note that my mouse cursor here changed. By the way, we got no hover effect only because all the styles we change in hover are overwritten by our disabled style here. So if you got more styles here set up for hovering, you might want to overwrite them here too, just as a side note. If we remove the disabled attribute in our HTML code, we'll go back from that disabled style to the old enabled style. And again, this transition is typically something you would do with the help of JavaScript. That's it for this module. This is our form styled, and this hopefully gave you some ideas about how you can approach the styling of inputs of forms as a whole, structure them in the way you want. We'll revisit this later when we learn about CSS Grid, but for now, this is where we'll finish. So that's it. That was the module on how you can approach the styling of form elements. In the end, it's not that different from the way you style other things in your app. You learned that for styling inputs, you have to watch out that many input elements have default browser styles, which you want to override, or override them with the inherit special value to inherit the values you define anywhere else in your web app or website. You learned about special pseudo selectors like focus to provide a good user feedback, or checked for the checkbox, for example. And you learned about the difference between outline and border again. We also had a look at validation, and you learned that you can give the user feedback with the valid and invalid pseudo selectors, or with manual validation done by adding some invalid class, or whatever you want to name it, to the elements you currently consider to be invalid. And we also had a look at buttons, and especially how we can style the disabled state with the help of the disabled attribute selector. And that's it. This is hopefully something which helps you in your next projects. Now, in the next module, Manual will take over again and will walk you through how you can style text in different ways in your application. So, let's move on to this module together now.